The New Mexico sun didn't rise that July morning. It laid siege. On the empty platform at Harrow's Bend, a woman held a letter over a fire she'd built in the dirt and watched her past turn to ash. No tears, no hesitation. She crushed the final ember beneath her boot, lifted the heavy carpentry box, and walked. The town watched her arrive. Conversations on porches died mid-sentence. A woman sweeping the millinery steps froze mid-stroke. Eyes followed her broad shoulders and steady stride, without welcome, without warmth. Only the particular stillness of a place deciding what to do with someone who refused to make herself smaller. From beyond the feedlot came the sound of hammering. 3 clean strikes. Pause. 3 more. The rhythm of work that did not care who was coming. She kept walking toward it. Harrow's Bend, New Mexico territory. July 1887. The platform was empty except for her, and the heat. The heat was not empty at all. It pressed down from every direction at once. The kind of heat that doesn't just sit on your skin, but gets inside your thinking and makes everything slower and heavier and less certain than it was before. The kind of heat that makes a person question decisions made in colder rooms, in a different season, when the future felt manageable and the map made sense. Nora Voss stood at the edge of the platform and held a letter over the small fire she'd made in the dirt. She didn't read it again. She already knew what it said. She'd read it 4 times on the train from Philadelphia and twice more in the station at Santa Fe and once in the dark outside Albuquerque when she couldn't sleep and thought, maybe, reading it. One more time would make it hurt less. The words would rearrange themselves into something she could live with. The meaning would soften. The particular cruelty of it would become somehow understandable. It didn't work that way. Words don't soften with rereading. They sharpen. They find new angles. They locate the places you thought were protected, and they press so. She burned it. The paper caught fast, dry as everything else out here. The words, her uncle's words, Henrik's brother, the man who had taken her in after her father died, and spent 4 years making sure she understood exactly how much space she was taking up in his house, in his life, in his general field of vision. The words turned black, and then turned to nothing. She watched them go. There was a satisfaction to it that she hadn't expected. Not triumph, not relief. Something quieter than either of those. The specific satisfaction of a decision made and executed, of a thing that cannot be undone, of a door that has been not merely closed, but removed from its frame entirely. She would not be going back to Philadelphia. She would not be writing to her uncle to explain herself or apologize for existing or ask for anything at all. She would not be reconsidering. The letter was ash. She pressed the last ember into the dirt with the toe of her boot, didn't look back. What she had instead, $12 in her coat pocket, which was not nothing but was not much either, and she knew the difference. A carpentry box that had belonged to her father, heavy enough that the wagon driver who had brought her from the station had offered twice to carry it, and she'd said no twice, and he'd stopped offering, which was the correct response. Not offense taken, just information processed, and a scrap of paper with a name and a direction, A. Hark. Hark Construction. Half-mile north of the feedlot, that was all. No description. No promise. No guarantee that when she arrived there would be anything waiting for her beyond what the advertisement in the Philadelphia paper had stated, a build project in New Mexico territory. An employer who preferred Dutch speakers and a need for a capable assistant. She had answered in English. She had not mentioned that she was a woman, because the advertisement hadn't asked, and she had learned long ago that information withheld is not the same as information concealed. It is simply information not yet provided, pending relevance. She had also not mentioned, because it also hadn't been asked, that she had spent 4 years helping her father in his workshop before his hands gave out. That she could read a blueprint, the way other people read a newspaper, quickly, with comprehension, noting the parts that mattered and moving on, that she could cut a clean line on the first pass. When she had a tool she trusted in her hand, that she was 24 years old and had been told in so many rooms, by so many people who meant it differently, that she was a lot to take in. She knew she was a lot to take in. She had stopped apologizing for it, somewhere around the age of 22, after the third time her uncle's wife had suggested, over a dinner that Nora had largely cooked, that perhaps smaller portions would help Nora feel more comfortable in herself, as if the problem was Nora's relationship with her own body, and not the rooming house's relationship with Nora's body being in it. She had not thrown anything. She had not cried. She had said very quietly that she found herself quite comfortable, thank you, and excused herself from the table and gone upstairs and sat on the edge of the bed in the room that was hers. In the way that borrowed rooms are yours, technically, provisionally, contingent on good behavior, and looked at her own hands in the dark. Large hands, strong hands, her father's hands more or less mapped onto a woman's body, capable hands. The kind of hands that knew what they were doing when they held a tool, and that left clear evidence of themselves in wood. She had decided that night to answer the advertisement. That had been 6 weeks ago. The advertisement had been 6 weeks before that. She had spent those 12 weeks between decision and departure in a state of very controlled forward motion, not allowing herself to slow down enough to reconsider, because reconsideration was where she lost things. She was better in motion. She was in motion now. She picked up the carpentry box. She started walking. The town of Harrow's Bend did not look like a place that welcomed anyone. It looked like a place that had made peace with enduring. There is a difference between those two things. Between a place that is glad you're here and a place that has simply accepted that people will arrive and depart and arrive again, the way weather does, indifferent to welcome or its absence. Harrow's Bend was the second kind. It had a permanence to it that wasn't warmth. The buildings were solid enough. The street was wide enough. But nothing had been built with an eye toward what it would feel like to walk down it for the first time, which told Nora something about the people who had built it, one main street. Buildings on both sides built fast and cheap, and without any particular affection for the people who would use them. The general store had a porch that leaned west, not dramatically, but enough that a person paying attention would notice and file it away, as a metaphor or as structural information, depending on the kind of person they were. Nora noted it as structural information. The church had no steeple and looked slightly embarrassed about it, though churches cannot be embarrassed, which was a thought she didn't pursue. There was a saloon. There was another saloon. The second one had a sign that said, "Cold beer," in letters so faded they were more suggestion than declaration, which seemed honest. Nora walked down the center of that street, with her carpentry box in her right hand and her smaller bag in her left, and the July sun hitting everything at a flat angle that left nowhere to hide. People noticed. That wasn't new. People always noticed Nora Voss. She was 24 years old and broad through the shoulders and full-bodied. In a way that her uncle's wife had spent the better part of 4 years trying to correct through smaller portions and pointed comments about what certain kinds of women looked like when they let themselves go. As if the body Nora inhabited was the result of some moral failing rather than simple genetics. As if her father's frame translated to a daughter the same way his cheekbones had. As if caring about this were a reasonable use of anyone's time. Her hair was the color of wheat in October, pinned up practical. No fuss, because fuss required time she didn't have, and attention she preferred to spend elsewhere. Her face was what her father had always called honest, meaning, she thought, that it didn't do much to hide what was happening behind it. Round cheeks that went pink in the heat and the cold both. Clear eyes, a color somewhere between blue and gray that couldn't make up its mind, which she had always felt suited her. A mouth that went flat when she was thinking. She was always thinking, not anxiously. Not the constant worried turning over of someone who cannot rest. More the way an engine runs, present, ongoing, purposeful, directed. Her mind had always been this way, running parallel to whatever her hands were doing, and it had made her strange in rooms where stillness was prized, and useful in workshops where the work required both kinds of attention at once. The men on the porch of the general store stopped their conversation, not rudely, just, completely. The way men stop when something enters their field of vision that doesn't match the category they've prepared for it. Nora had seen it before. She knew what it was. She did not perform unawareness of it, because performing unawareness requires a particular kind of energy she had never been willing to spend. She simply did not adjust her pace, did not look around to see who was looking, did not do the things she'd trained herself to do over years of walking into rooms where she was not expected, which was to make herself smaller, quieter, less. She was done making herself smaller. She had decided this on the platform, watching the letter turn to ash, and she intended to hold to it. Not as defiance. Defiance is still reactive, still organized around what other people think. As simply the way she intended to proceed from here forward. She would take up the space she took up. She would do the work she came to do. She would be Nora Voss, who was a lot to take in. And if that was uncomfortable for anyone, they were welcome to look elsewhere. A woman sweeping the steps of the millinery paused mid-stroke and watched. Nora walked north, past the feedlot. She smelled it before she saw it, which was useful information about the geography of this town, and followed the sound she recognized before she rounded the bend. Hammering, 3 strokes, clean set. Move the rhythm of someone who had been doing this long enough that it had stopped being a skill and become something closer to breathing. Not hurried, not slow, exactly at the pace the material required. She recognized it the way you recognize a familiar word in a foreign sentence, with a particular relief, with a specific pleasure of something to present itself in an unfamiliar place. She smelled the build site before she saw it fully. Fresh cut pine, iron nails warming in the sun, and underneath both of those, the particular smell of sawdust that always did something to Nora's chest. The way walking into a kitchen smells like home even in a stranger's house. Even when you've never had much of a home to remember. Even when home is more concept than location. You know the smell. You know what it's asking of you. Sawdust had always asked Nora to stay. She came around the bend and stopped. The structure was not finished. Barely started, really. But started with intention, which was different from barely started by accident. A foundation laid solid, which she could assess from where she stood, by the way, sat in the ground, settled, and sure, not the anxious perch of work done too fast. 4 walls, framed out but open to the sky. The spaces where windows and doors would go already clearly planned in the structure of the framing. Not afterthoughts, but intentions built in from the beginning. The roof a skeleton of beams that the afternoon light cut through in long diagonal lines that landed on the ground inside like something deliberate. Like a plan for what the light would do, worked out in advance. Whoever ran this site knew what they were doing. Lumber stacked and sorted with a precision she noted automatically, with a part of her mind that was always noting things. By length, by thickness, the cuts already chalked. Not thrown together, organized. The organization of a person who had thought through the sequence of the work and arranged the materials accordingly. One man on site. He was up on the east wall frame, one boot braced against a beam, driving nails with that rhythm she'd heard from down the road. 3 strokes, clean set, move. She watched him work for a moment. He was tall in the way that becomes obvious only when a man is in motion, the height revealing itself in the reach and arc of the work rather than in the simple fact of standing, very tall. Broad through the shoulders in a way that was not bulk for its own sake, but rather the accumulated result of years of physical work, the body shaped by what it had been asked to do. Dark hair going silver at the edges. Collarless shirt, dark with sweat at the back. Hat pushed up on his forehead because both his hands were busy, and there was no one else here to hold it. He hadn't heard her arrive. She watched him for one moment, 2. The way he moved, deliberate, unhurried, each motion complete in itself before the next one began. Nothing wasted, just the work, executed by a man who had made peace with the particular requirements of this kind of work, and had stopped fighting them. She recognized that quality in him, the not fighting. It was rarer than it looked. Then she said, "Mr. Hark." He drove one more nail before he turned. The look he gave her was not hostile, not warm. It was the look of a man who has spent enough years reading situations quickly that his face had learned to stay empty, while his mind was already 3 steps ahead, processing, sorting, filing. He looked at her. He looked at the carpentry box, which was her father's, and which showed its age in the good way, in the way of tools that had been used by people who knew how to use them. He looked at her again. "You're the applicant," he said, not a question. A statement being tested against the available evidence and found, apparently, to hold. Nora Voss, she didn't extend her hand. The box was in it, and she wasn't inclined to put it down yet, not until she knew where she was putting it. "I wrote in April. You sent back a start date." A pause. He climbed down from the wall frame in 2 easy movements. The movements of a man comfortable with heights and with his own body's capabilities. No hesitation. No performance of casualness. When he was standing on level ground, she understood the height she'd assessed from a distance was not an exaggeration. He was well over 6 feet. He moved with the particular unhurried quality of men who have done physical labor their whole lives, the quality that is not slowness, but is its own kind of speed. The efficiency of someone who has learned not to waste motion. He was, she registered with some irritation, a very striking-looking man. The irritation was at herself, not at him. She had not come here to notice what he looked like. She had come here to work. But the noticing happened regardless of intention, which was the irritating part. Dark eyes that held the particular quality of someone who looked at things directly, not aggressively, not challengingly, simply directly, as a matter of habit. Sun-weathered in a way that was not damage, but was rather the evidence of a life spent, mostly outside, the face shaped by weather and by the particular concentration of squinting into light and wind. Lines at the corners of his eyes. Jaw set firm under several days of dark stubble, going silver at the edges the same way his hair was, the silver coming in at the temples and spreading inward, with the patient determination of things that cannot be stopped. 40 years old, or close to it. The kind of face that had been handsome once in a conventional way and had since become something more interesting than handsome. The handsomeness remaining but complicated now. The way a landscape is more interesting after a storm has moved through it. He was looking at her carpentry box with an expression she couldn't immediately read. "You're not what I pictured," he said. "That happens a lot," she said. "Does it change the start date?" A pause. Longer this time. She let it sit. She had learned not to fill silences that didn't belong to her. Her uncle had been a filler of silences, a man who treated quiet as a problem requiring immediate solution, and she had watched how exhausting it was for everyone around him, including himself. She had learned to let silence do its work. "You know carpentry?" he said. Also not a question. "A point of inquiry," I said I did in the letter. "Saying and knowing aren't always the same thing, Miss Voss." "No," she agreed. "They aren't." She set the carpentry box down on a sawhorse. Not roughly. She never handled it roughly. It had been her father's, and she treated it accordingly. Unlatched it, pulled out her father's marking gauge. Brass-fitted. Well used. Kept clean the way her father had kept everything, with the respect of someone who understood that tools are not just objects but the extension of a person's ability to do work in the world, and that neglecting them is a form of self-neglect. She held it and looked at the nearest lumber stack. "Pick a board," she said. "Any thickness. Tell me what you need." He looked at her for another moment, the assessment continuing, unhurried. Then he walked to the stack, pulled a plank and said, 3/4 inch from the edge, 8 inches. Clean line. She took the plank, set it across the sawhorse, adjusted the marking gauge by feel, without looking at the measurement markings. Because she had used this tool so many times, over so many years, that she knew it the way she knew her own hands, knew the feel of it at each setting, the resistance of the fence against the wood, the depth required for the line she wanted, drew the line in one smooth pass. Single stroke, no hesitation, no going back over it. She handed the plank back. He looked at the line. He looked at it for long enough that she started counting seconds in her head. Not because she was nervous. She wasn't nervous, or rather she was, and had learned to distinguish between the nervous that is fear and the nervous that is simply the body responding to high stakes, with additional alertness. This was the second kind. She was alert. She was present. She was not afraid of the line she'd drawn. 4. 5. "You can start now," he said. "I want to," she said. He handed her a hammer without ceremony, not with reluctance overcome, not with significant decision, just handed it to her because she was the carpenter, and that's what carpenters use, and turned back to the east wall. And that was the entire interview. No references checked, no further questions about her background, or her capabilities, or her origins, or what had brought a woman who looked like Nora Voss to a build site in New Mexico territory in July of 1887. Just the line she'd drawn, just the plank he'd held, just the hammer. She went to work. What Amos Hart did not say that first afternoon was that she was the fourth person to answer his advertisement. He thought about it later, when the light was going and the day's work was done, and she had collected her things and left for whatever rooming house she'd arranged, and he was alone on the site with the structure he was building. And the particular silence of late afternoon in the desert, which is a silence that has texture to it, a presence, not merely the absence of sound, but a thing in itself. He thought about the first applicant, who had been a boy of about 16, with soft hands and a borrowed hammer, who quit after 2 hours when the heat became unreasonable. The heat had not become unreasonable. The heat was what it always was in July in New Mexico territory. The boy had simply encountered it and discovered that the version of himself that answered advertisements about construction work was not the version that could stand in it for 8 hours driving nails. He thought about the second applicant, a man of 40 who genuinely knew his craft. Amos had been able to see that within the first hour, the competence was real, and who had drunk himself into uselessness before the end of day one. Not dramatically, just steadily, from a flask he kept in his coat, until the work became imprecise, and then became impossible, and then became the kind of situation where someone had to go home. And it was not going to be Amos. He thought about the third applicant, who had not shown up at all, not even a letter, not even an explanation, just a silence where a person should have been. That one had been the hardest. In its way, the absence of a person you'd arranged your expectations around was its own particular kind of letdown. The disappointment that had no one to receive it, no reason to point to, just the fact of the empty space where someone had promised to be and then wasn't. He had placed the advertisement again, same wording, same newspaper, with very low expectations. The letter from Philadelphia had arrived on a Tuesday, in handwriting that was steady and even, which told him before the content did that the person who had written it was someone in reasonable control of themselves, someone who wasn't rushed or anxious enough to let it show in the script. The list of skills was specific without being boastful. Whoever had written it knew the difference between trim work and structural carpentry and was careful to distinguish which they were more confident in, which was the mark of someone who understood that overstating your skills in a trade that will immediately test them is its own form of failure. He had written back the start date without asking for clarification on anything. He recognized now that might have been an oversight. But the line she'd drawn with the marking gauge was straight as a rule. Not almost straight, straight, done without hesitation, and without the particular quality of performance that shows up in people who are trying to prove something, the slight staginess of a demonstration. She had simply drawn the line, the way she would have drawn it if no one were watching, because the line was what mattered and the drawing was the means to the line, and everything else was beside the point. In Amos Hart's experience, that combination, confidence without performance, competence without show, was rarer than people understood. He had worked alongside men for 20 years who were good at what they did, and who nonetheless couldn't do it without some form of audience, some relationship with being observed. Not always vanity, sometimes just the need for witness, for someone to know that the work was happening. He understood the impulse. He had felt it himself years ago. He had stopped feeling it when Anna died, or more precisely, had stopped feeling the need for it. He worked now without witness, because he had lost the person whose witnessing had mattered most to him, and everyone else was beside the point. He handed Nora Voss a hammer. He pointed at the next section of framing. She got to work. And he went back to his own work, and the afternoon moved forward, and the site had 2 people on it instead of 1, and something about the particular sound of 2 hammers working rather than 1 settled into the background of his awareness. And stayed there, not disturbing anything, simply present, like a second voice in a room that had been quiet for a long time. The town had noticed by late afternoon, Harrow's Bend was not a large place. 300 permanent residents, give or take, the give being the cattle workers and trail riders who came through seasonally, and the take being the people who left, for reasons that towns like this one generate quietly and continuously. Young people who went east for education or opportunity and didn't return. Older people who went to family elsewhere when the body started making demands that a small town without a doctor couldn't meet. 2 lawyers. No doctor within 40 miles, which was a fact that settled into your awareness differently depending on how often you needed a doctor. A social order that had calcified around a set of agreements so old that nobody remembered agreeing to them. The agreements were simply there, like the mountains, like the heat, like the particular quality of light at this elevation in this territory. One of those agreements was that Amos Hark was a known quantity. Difficult. People said, meaning he doesn't participate in the social negotiations that keep a small community running. Fair, people also said, meaning he pays what he owes and doesn't ask for what he doesn't have coming. Honest to a degree that some people found uncomfortable, meaning he tells the truth, whether or not the truth is what you were hoping to hear, and he does this not with cruelty but with the simple indifference to your comfort that comes not from considering your comfort his responsibility. His build site was his business. Everyone understood this. Another agreement, equally firm and equally unspoken, was that certain things did not belong in Harrow's Bend. The woman from the supply wagon had been noted on arrival. The carpentry box had been noted, heavy for a woman, they said, meaning, this is irregular, this does not match the category we've prepared. Her direction of travel north, half-mile past the feedlot, had been noted, and now, several hours later, she was on the Hark site with a hammer in her hand, and the particular posture of someone who knew how to use one. Constance Whitmore noticed first, because Constance Whitmore always noticed first. This was not incidental to who she was. It was the core of it. Constance had organized her entire life around the management of information. Who had it, what it meant, what should be done about it. In a different life, in a different time, she might have been a remarkable editor, or a diplomat, or an intelligence officer. In this life, in Harrow's Bend in 1887, she was the wife of the man who owned the bank and the social center of gravity for every Women's Society's church committee in the territory, and she applied the same considerable intelligence to the same considerably narrower field. She was also, in a private and individual sense, not an unkind woman. This mattered. Constance would have told you had you asked. She would have been right and also wrong, in the way that people are both right and wrong when they use their private goodness to excuse their public harm. Constance Whitmore was kind to individuals. She was unkind to categories. And the woman she was watching move around the Hark build site with a hammer in her hand had been sorted into a category before she'd cleared the bend in the road, the broad shoulders. The deliberate way she moved, without checking to see who was watching, without that particular feminine awareness of being observed that Constance had performed so long it had become unconscious. The hammer going down clean and sure, no hesitation, no adjustment for the fact of being seen. That won't do, Constance said quietly to the woman beside her. Not with heat, not with malice, in the sense of malice requiring consciousness of harm, and a decision to cause it anyway. With the calm certainty of a woman who has decided that certain things are true and intends to make them so. The way a woman says something she intends to be true. The rooming house was run by Bertie Callum, who had a policy of not asking questions and a secondary policy of asking precisely enough questions to know everything important. The two policies coexisted without apparent contradiction, which was possible because Bertie had a very precise sense of what counted as important, and almost none of what most people considered important fell within that definition. She was a compact woman in her 50s, with gray hair pinned back severely, and eyes that missed nothing. She moved through her own establishment with the quiet efficiency of someone who had long since made peace with the scale of their domain and found it entirely sufficient. The rooming house was hers. It ran the way she wanted it to run. People came and went, and she extended to them a specific form of hospitality that was not warmth exactly, but was something more durable, a kind of reliable competence, an assurance that the things they needed would be provided and the things they didn't need would not be imposed. She showed Nora to a room at the end of the upstairs hall. "End rooms are quieter," she said. By way of explanation or possibly by way of assessment, an end room was also easier to watch, from a management perspective, to know who was coming and going. Handed her a key, said, "Supper at 6. Late arrivals don't get plates held." "I'll be there," Nora said. "You're working for Hark." Flat. A fact being tested against the available evidence. Starting today, Bertie looked at her for a moment. The assessment was thorough without being invasive. She was looking for information, not performing scrutiny. "He's not an easy man," she said. "That's fine," Nora said. "I'm not an easy woman." Something shifted in Bertie's expression. Not warmth exactly. Warmth would come later and would need to be earned, which Bertie understood and respected as a principle. But the first movement toward it, the recognition of a thing that might eventually become warmth if the circumstances cooperated. 6, Bertie said, and left supper was beans and cornbread. Good beans, well-seasoned, which told Nora something about Bertie's standards that she filed away, along with the other information she'd collected since stepping off the supply wagon. The cornbread was the kind that didn't require apology, dense and real, and not trying to be something it wasn't, which was the standard Nora applied to most things. The dining room had that particular quality of silence that she had learned to read over years of walking into rooms where she was not expected. Not hostile silence. Hostility has its own sound, a sharpening of the air, a quality of attention that is not attention, but rather a form of directed pressure. This was something softer, and in its own way harder. The silence of people who are not sure what category to put you in and are waiting for more information before they commit. 4 other boarders. 2 cattle hands who ate fast and talked only to each other. The conversation of men who have worked alongside each other, long enough that most of the communication happens in the gaps between words. A young man who kept his eyes on his plate with the focus of someone doing it deliberately, someone who had learned that not looking was a form of safety. A woman of about 60, in a dark dress who said nothing at all, but watched Nora with attention that was not unfriendly. The attention of someone who has been watching people long enough to find them interesting regardless of category. Nora ate. She was hungry enough that she didn't calculate how it looked. She had learned that the performance of appetite, the careful management of how much and how fast, and what face to make about it, was an enormous tax on a woman's energy, and she had stopped paying it some years ago. Food was necessary. She was hungry. She ate. After Batty brought coffee and sat down at the end of the table in a way that was not quite joining the meal but was also not quite standing apart from it. A signal, Nora read, that this was a conversation being offered rather than imposed. She accepted it. "You got family?" Bertie asked. "Not anymore," Nora said. "Dutch name. My father was from Utrecht. I grew up speaking both." This was true and also strategically offered. She knew, or suspected, that in a town where Amos Hark's family had Dutch roots, speaking Dutch might matter. She didn't know yet how much. She was gathering information. Bertie nodded slowly. "Hark's family were Dutch settlers," she said. "His grandfather built half the original structures in this county. He's particular about the craft." A pause. "Particular about most things. I noticed," Nora said. "The town's going to talk," Bertie said. Not as warning, not as threat. As simple information delivery, which Nora appreciated. It's not personal. It's just this is the kind of town that talks. Nora wrapped both hands around her coffee mug. The coffee was good, also better than it needed to be, which continued to tell her things about Bertie. "What are they going to say?" she asked. Bertie tilted her head. The kind of slight movement that means I've already thought about this and can give you a direct answer. "That a woman like you has no business on a build site," she said. that whatever Hark's thinking, he ought to think again. That you came from somewhere nobody knows, and that means something in a town like this. She paused. None of it means anything, actually. But they'll say it. Nora looked at the surface of her coffee. The coffee was dark and honest in the mug. Not the watery suggestion of coffee that you sometimes got in establishments that were stretching their budget, but the real thing. She found this comforting in a way she hadn't expected. My uncle used to say I took up too much room in every room I walked into, she said. She wasn't sure why she said it. Maybe because the coffee was good and the room was quiet and there was something about Bertie Callum that felt like a person you could say a true thing to. He meant it as a complaint. I've been trying to decide for a few years now whether to take it as one. Bertie was quiet for a moment. A useful silence, not an uncomfortable one. How's that going, she asked. I burned his letter this morning, Nora said. So. Progress. Something moved through Bertie's expression. Not sympathy, or not only sympathy. Something more complicated. The recognition of a particular kind of clarity that people arrive at by difficult paths. She picked up her own coffee and didn't then say anything else about it, which was the exactly correct response. She arrived at the site the next morning before first light. This required getting up in the dark. In a narrow bed in a borrowed room, in a town she'd arrived in the day before, in a territory she'd never lived in a heat that had released its grip only partially overnight, and was already building again, before the sun cleared the ridge. It required a degree of deliberateness that she recognized as the deliberateness of someone who has decided something and is executing the decision before doubt can find its footing. She had decided to get there first. She didn't fully understand why it mattered yet. She would understand it later, that it was about setting the terms of her own presence, about arriving in the space before anyone else could decide what her arrival meant, about the small daily statement of I am here, and I was here before you. But in that first morning, before she had the language for it, she simply moved through the dark and the heat toward the site, because she had decided to, and because her body, when she let it, was very good at executing decisions her mind had made. Amos Hark was already there. She had expected this, or half expected it. She had somehow known, from the one afternoon she'd observed him, that he was the kind of man who didn't waste the early hours, who was already 3 steps into the work before most people had finished deciding to start. She felt something that was adjacent to relief and also adjacent to a competitive response that she found slightly absurd in herself. She had wanted to get there first, and she hadn't. And this was a negligible fact that her mind had apparently filed as significant. He didn't say good morning. He handed her a set of measurements he'd taken at dawn, when the air was briefly cool enough to think in, and said, West wall, window rough openings, 3 of them.
I want the framing done before noon.
Placement, she asked. He showed her. She asked 2 questions, one about header depth given the span, because the load path mattered, and she wanted to know she was thinking about the same way he was. One about stud configuration at the corners, because doubled and tripled are different decisions, and she'd seen both done wrong and neither done wrong, and the difference is in knowing which situation you're in. Both times he stopped and looked at her with an expression she hadn't seen before. Not surprise exactly. The line she'd drawn the day before had adjusted his expectations somewhat. But something, the expression of a man quietly revising a calculation he'd already made, not dramatically, just moving a number in a column to the corrected position doubled, he said, not load-bearing at that point. All right, she said, and got to work. By 10 she had 2 openings framed. By noon she had all 3. The work had gone the way good work goes when you know what you're doing and the materials cooperate. Cleanly, without drama. Each step following logically from the last. The structure, growing with the particular inevitability of things designed well and executed carefully. She had also noticed, without being asked, without making a production of it, that the eastern sill plate had a slight warp. Lumber warps. This is a fact of working with wood and heat, and any carpenter who expects otherwise has either never worked with wood or has worked with it only in controlled conditions. The warp was slight, but it was there, and if she set the studs without addressing it. The window opening would not hang true, and a window opening that doesn't hang true is a window that will close properly, a draft that will come in. Around the seal, a problem that compounds over time. She shimmed it before she set the first stud, before she continued with the planned work. She took the time to shim the sill plate level. It added maybe 20 minutes. It was the correct thing to do. Amos found it in the afternoon when he came to check the work. He didn't speak for a moment, just looked. Ran his thumb along the edge of the shim where it met the plate, pressing lightly, feeling for flex or gap or the specific wrongness that shows up in work, done carelessly, flotch, clean. The shim was precisely what it needed to be, and nothing more. You shimmed the sill, he said. It had a warp, she said. I know, he said. I was going to address it tomorrow. I addressed it today. She looked at him. Is that a problem? He held his thumb against the shim for one more second. She watched him process this. The fact of the shim, the quality of the shim, the decision she'd made to do it without being asked. Processing, not as a man who resented the initiative, but as a man who was taking accurate measure of what had happened. No, he said. It's not a problem. He moved on to checking the next section. And Nora went back to the work. But something had shifted between them. Not dramatically. There was nothing dramatic about it. Not with announcement. Just shifted. The way the light shifts in late afternoon without your noticing, until the shadows are somewhere they weren't before. A small calibration. A piece of information exchanged without words. She had done the work. The work was correct. She had seen a problem that needed addressing, and had addressed it. He had looked at the evidence, and accepted what the evidence said. That was all, and it was enough. The trouble came on the fourth day. She'd been expecting something. Not necessarily this shape of something. She hadn't known about Gerald Whitmore yet, hadn't known about the particular form that organized disapproval takes in a small town with a bank at its center. But she had known, in the way she always knew, that the silence around her wasn't permanent, that the watching was a preliminary to something, that the particular quality of stillness she moved through every day, on the street between Bertie's rooming house and the build site, was the stillness of something gathering, rather than the stillness of something resolved. She had Bertie's warning. She had her own 24 years of experience. She knew. The trouble came in the form of Gerald Whitmore, who arrived at the build site mid-morning in a suit that cost more than Nora had in her coat pocket. He had the kind of confidence that belongs to men who own things. Not arrogance, which is a performance, but something quieter, and in some ways more impenetrable, the simple bone-deep assumption that the world is organized around his interests, because the world has, so far, substantially confirmed this assumption. He stood at the edge of the site with his hands in his pockets, which was the stance of a man who wants to look casual, and doesn't need to try very hard, because casual is his default. Watched for a while. Let the watching establish something. Then spoke. Hark, he said pleasantly. Pleasantly. Everything about Gerald Whitmore was pleasant. Pleasantness was his primary instrument. Wanted to talk about the property boundary on the northern edge. There's been some question. Amos was on the roof framing. He came down without hurrying, deliberately, pointedly unhurried, the message in the pace as much as anything else. Gerald, he said. There's no question about the boundary. Surveys on file. Surveys can be revisited, Whitmore said. Especially when there's community concern. A pause. Nora kept working. She did not look up. She had very good ears, and she had spent enough of her life in rooms where decisions about her were being made in voices calibrated to be plausibly not quite overheard. Community concern, Amos said. Flat. Not inflected as a question. Inflected as a statement being repeated to examine it. About the nature of the project, Whitmore said. And the personnel involved. My personnel, Amos said. Is my business, in principle, Whitmore said. Pleasantly, always pleasantly. But this is a small town, Hark. When people talk enough, it becomes a civic matter. You understand? Amos said nothing for a moment. Nora heard the weight of that silence and understood it. It was not the silence of a man who didn't know what to say. It was the silence of a man choosing carefully among several things he could say. How's Constance? Amos said. Whitmore blinked. She's well. Good. Give her my regards. I'll have my lawyer send you a copy of the survey if it'll put the matter to rest. He turned back to the site. The conversation was over, because Amos had decided it was over. Whitmore stood for another moment, a small performance of unhurriedness, of a man who leaves when he chooses to. Then he left. Nora set her hammer down slowly. She turned and found Amos already looking at her. He had that stillness again. Not calm, she was learning. But the thing that happens instead of visible anger in a man who has taught himself to convert it, who has somewhere along the way learned that visible anger gives away information you might not want to give away. He came because of me, she said. He came because he had time to fill, Amos said. Don't let him use it. She held his gaze for a moment, picked up the hammer. All right, she said. But her hands were not entirely steady for the next hour, and she hated that they weren't. Not because she was afraid, she wasn't, or not in any simple sense, but because her hands were the part of her that she trusted most completely, the part that did not lie, the part that processed what the rest of her was feeling and rendered it in the quality of the work. And the quality of the work for the next hour was slightly off, the nails going in at a very slightly less than perfect angle. The measurements checked one more time than they needed to be. Not enough that anyone watching would have noticed. Enough that she noticed. And she filed it, and she was angry about it. And the anger was useful in the end, because it gave her something to push against, something to be more deliberate then. By the time the afternoon light started going sideways across the site, her hands were steady again. That evening, she sat on the steps of Bertie's rooming house, in the last of the daylight, and looked at her own hands resting flat on her knees. She had a habit she'd developed after her parents died. Writing letters to no one in particular. She'd lost the people she used to write to. Her father first, then her mother 2 years later, the grief of the second loss, compounded by the way it closed the last door of the first. The way losing the person you've been grieving with is a different category of loss than the original. She'd been 17 when her father died. She'd been 19 when her mother followed. And she'd been left with all the things she would have said to them and no one to say them to. So she wrote them down, folded them, kept them in the box with the tools, which was the most accurate thing she could have done with them, keeping the words and the work together, the two things that most reliably felt like herself. She didn't write that night. She just sat and thought about what Amos had said. Don't let him use it, not, don't worry. She appreciated the absence of that. Don't worry was a sentence that meant, I want you to stop having the feeling you're having, because it makes me uncomfortable, and it was almost never useful. Not, it'll be fine. That was a prediction she couldn't verify, and he couldn't either. Not any of the smoothing over words she'd been given her whole life by people who meant well, or by people who meant to manage her, or by people who didn't bother to distinguish between the two, because the effect was the same. Just, don't let him use it, as if she had the power to choose, as if the choice was hers. She pressed her palms flat on her knees and looked at them in the fading light. The calluses on her palms from years of handling tools. The specific small scar on the heel of her right hand from a chisel that had slipped when she was 16, and her grip had been wrong, a lesson she had not needed twice. Her father's hands essentially mapped onto her body, the same proportions, the same weight to them, the same capacity for work. Maybe she did have the power to choose. She thought about Gerald Whitmore, standing at the edge of the site with his hands in his pockets, pleasant and implacable. She thought about Constance Whitmore, whom she hadn't met yet, but who she already understood in the general outline of the thing, the type, before the specific. She thought about what they wanted from this situation and what they had to use. They had social pressure, which was real but not infinite. They had the particular kind of leverage that comes from owning things in a small town. They did not have the work. They didn't touch the work. Whatever happened with the social pressure, the work was between Nora and Amos and the structure they were building. And that was not available to Gerald Whitmore's pleasantness, or his wife's organized disapproval. She pressed her palms flat on her knees and looked at them and thought, maybe she did. From down the road, distant and steady, came the sound of hammering. He was still working. In the dark that was just beginning to establish itself, in the heat that didn't fully break until near midnight out here, he was still working. The same rhythm she'd heard from down the road that first afternoon. 3 strokes, clean set, move. The sound of something being built out of nothing, by a man who didn't stop when the light ran out, who kept the work going past the point where most people would call it a day. She went inside, climbed the stairs, lay on her back in the narrow bed, with her eyes open and the desert dark pressing against the single window. Tomorrow, she thought. Tomorrow she'd get there before him. She got there before him. The satisfaction of this was disproportionate to its significance, which she acknowledged and didn't try to correct. The mind finds its small victories where it can, and the small victories are sometimes what keeps the larger effort going. She was already at the sawhorses, already reviewing the measurements from the day before, when she heard his boots on the gravel behind her. "Morning," she said without turning around. A pause. "You're early." She didn't answer that. Wasn't much to say. He walked past her to the lumber pile, checked a board for warp, running his hand down the length of it, setting one end on the ground and sighting down the other. The quick assessment of someone who has checked more boards for warp than he can count. Said, "South wall today. Door frame first." "I know," she said. "I was looking at the plans last night." A longer pause. She heard him set the board down. "You have the plans," he said. "You left a copy in the toolbox. Wednesday," she said. "I assumed you meant for me to have it." He hadn't meant anything by it. She could tell by the fraction of a second before he answered. The tiny gap of a man who has discovered something he didn't intend to reveal and is processing it. He'd simply forgotten the copy was there. But she watched him decide in real time not to correct the assumption, not to claim an intention he hadn't had, just to let the assumption stand, because it was more useful than the alternative, and because telling the truth about it would require a different kind of conversation than the one they were having. "What do you think about the door placement?" he said instead. She turned around. "I think you've got 6 inches more clearance on the east side than you need, and you're short on the west. If you shift the frame 8 inches left, your swing path clears the interior wall, without notching the baseboard later." He was quiet. "That's what I was going to do this morning," he said. "Then we agree," she said, and turned back to her chalk lines. She heard him pick up the board again. And then, she wasn't sure she heard it at first, wasn't sure she was interpreting it correctly, because she hadn't heard it from him before and had no baseline to compare it to. But there it was, he was laughing, quietly, almost under his breath, the way a man laughs at something that genuinely surprised him, that got past his guard before he could decide whether to admit it. Not the social laugh, not the performed amusement of someone demonstrating that they have a sense of humor. The real thing, small and involuntary and gone in a moment. She didn't turn around, but she felt it in her chest like the first warm day after a long winter. Unexpected, insufficient for the cold it was trying to address, and somehow exactly right anyway. She went back to her chalk lines and kept working, and did not examine the feeling, because she had learned that some feelings dissolve when you look directly at them, and some feelings are better left to do their work in the peripheral. The door frame was set by 10. Good work. She knew it and he knew it, and neither of them said so, because people who actually understand their craft don't generally need to say things out loud. The work says what it says. They just move to the next thing. The next thing was the interior partition wall. She was measuring the center line when she heard the voices. More than one. Coming from the road, 3 women. Standing at the edge of the property, with the particular studied casualness of people who want to be noticed without technically intruding. The one in front was Constance Whitmore. Nora had learned the name from Bertie 2 nights ago and filed it with the attention she gave to things that would matter. Constance Whitmore was a handsome woman in her late 40s who had dressed for this Tuesday morning with deliberate care. Not the carelessness of someone who always is dressed this way, but the calculation of someone who knew what she wanted her appearance to communicate and had dressed to communicate it. The two women behind her were younger and had the careful expressions of people brought along to witness something. Witnesses have a particular look when they've been deployed rather than invited, Mr. Hark. Constance's voice was pleasant. Genuinely pleasant, not a performance of pleasantness. She had cultivated this over years, and it was real enough, now that the distinction barely mattered. Amos put down his pencil and walked to the edge of the site with that unhurried step that Nora was beginning to understand. It was not calmness, but something more deliberate than calmness. The movement of a man who had decided years ago not to give situations more energy than they deserved, Mrs. Whitmore. I hope we're not interrupting. Which meant she hoped they were. We were just passing. The build is coming along beautifully. Her gaze moved past Amos and found Nora and settled there with the particular precision of someone who has been practicing this form of attention for decades. And this must be your new helper. This is Miss Voss, Amos said. She's my carpenter. The word landed like something solid. Not assistant, not hired hand, not softened or modified or hedged. My carpenter. Nora heard it and felt something in her chest that she identified, with some surprise, as gratitude, and then identified more precisely as the response to being correctly named, to having the thing you are stated without apology. Of course, Constance said warmly. We've all heard about Miss Voss. The warmth was genuine in the way warmth can be genuine and weaponized simultaneously. She tilted her head. She's not from here, is she? Philadelphia, Nora said. Because she was not going to stand 15 feet away and be discussed in the third person. Constance turned to look at her directly. Up close, the smile was more complicated than it had seemed. Layered, practiced, carrying underneath it the architecture of a woman who has learned to use pleasantness the way other people use locks. Philadelphia. That's a very long way to come for construction work, dear. Good work is worth traveling for, Nora said moo. Constance glanced at the site, at the framing, at the door frame they'd set that morning. It's just that in a town this size, we do worry about appearances, the kind of example that's set. I'm sure you understand Nora understood perfectly. She had been understanding this particular sentence her entire life. The sentence that means you don't belong here, delivered in the particular tone that makes it sound like concern. She understood that Constance Whitmore was doing what she had always done. The social environment around a conclusion she had already reached, and wanted everyone else to reach as well. She opened her mouth. Amos spoke first. Mrs. Whitmore, he said, I'll let my lawyer know. You stopped by. He's been meaning to speak to someone from the property committee about the Northern Survey. Since your husband already has an interest in the matter, it might as well start there. He nodded. Easy as weather. You have a good morning now. Constance Whitmore's smile held for exactly one more second. Then it went the way all performed smiles eventually go, into something flatter and more honest, which in this case was not flattering. She left. The two women followed without speaking. Nora waited until the footsteps had faded. You didn't have to do that, she said quietly. I know. He said I was going to answer her. I know that too. He picked up his pencil, walked back to the partition wall. But she wasn't talking to you. She was talking at me through you. That's a different thing. He crouched down and made a mark. You shouldn't have to answer for what other people are saying at someone else. Nora looked at the back of him for a long moment. At this quiet, weathered man who said 12 words a day, and most of them about lumber, who had just said, without inflection, without making anything of it, the exact thing she had needed someone to say for most of her adult life. She turned back to her measurements. Her hand was steadier than the day before. The week went the way hard weeks go, not dramatically, not with the cleanness of a clear antagonist and a clear confrontation and a clear result, with a grinding persistence that wore at the edges of things, the kind of pressure that doesn't break anything, but makes everything slightly harder than it was. Good did not deliver the lumber. The supply wagon that had been arranged made arrangement elsewhere. Two men who had been passing friendly with Amos on the street found reasons to be on the other side of it before they reached him. Not unfriendly, just unavailable. The rooming house stayed open to Nora. Bertie Callum drew a line there that nobody tested. Because Bertie Callum was someone whose lines you didn't test. But the dining room got louder when Nora walked in and quieter the moment she sat down. She noticed all of it, filed it, did not mention it to Amos. What she noticed just as carefully, with just as much attention, was what didn't change. The work changed nothing. The sight held, the rhythm of two people learning each other's pace, not discussing it, not negotiating it, just finding it through repetition the way a door finds its hinge, kept finding itself. She knew, by now, the particular kind of silence that meant he was thinking about a structural problem. She knew the way he checked lumber, the hand down the length, the sighting down the end, well enough that she'd started doing it herself in a slightly different way that was hers. He knew, she suspected, that she always measured twice, and that the second measurement was not doubt, but confirmation. That she had a slight preference for the right side when working at a sawhorse. That she hummed sometimes when she was fitting tight joints, very quietly, the same fragment of melody repeated, the way people do when they're concentrating. She noticed on the 6th day that he had brought 2 cups of coffee to the site and set one beside her without asking. No comment, no ceremony. Just the cup, left side of the sawhorse where she would find it. She didn't say anything. Neither did he. She drank every drop. The lumber arrived from Denton on a Thursday. Not from the original supplier, from a man named Caldwell who drove his wagon 42 miles without announcement or explanation, handed Amos a folded note and waited while it was read. Amos read it. His face did something she hadn't seen before. Not quite surprise, because surprise implies the event falls outside any range you'd considered, and this didn't look like that. It looked like the receipt of something larger than expected. He handed it to Nora without speaking. She read it, Mr. Hark. Heard what good did. My father built fence posts with your grandfather's hands back when this territory was half rocks and optimism. This load is on my account. Don't argue with old men. R. Caldwell Denton. She looked up. He drove 42 miles, she said. Apparently, Amos said. They looked at each other. And in that look was something that neither of them had quite the language for yet. Not gratitude, exactly. Gratitude has an object, and this was more diffuse than that. The feeling underneath gratitude. The feeling of discovering that you are not carrying something alone that you had been certain you were carrying alone. The specific, structural relief of an unexpected ally. 4 days later, Amos came to where she was fitting blocking and said, "The property committee closed the deed challenge this morning. My lawyer filed the response before breakfast. Burrell signed off by noon." She blinked. That was fast. Caldwell, the man who sent the lumber, he sits on the property committee. Has for 12 years. Nora stared at him. The same man. She thought about that. About a man 42 miles away who had seen what was happening and had decided to be in the way of it. Not with a speech, not with a confrontation. With lumber, with a signed document, with 12 years of positioned patience. Why? She said. He knew Anna, Amos said. His voice changed slightly on the name, not dramatically, not in a way that would be visible from a distance, but she heard it. Their families were from the same region in the Netherlands. He came to the service when she died. He paused. He told me afterward that if anyone gave me trouble about the build, I should tell him. She had good friends. Nora said she made them, Amos said. That was one of her particular skills. She walked into rooms and people wanted to help her. Not because she needed it, because she made people feel like helping was worth doing. He was looking at Nora when he finished saying that. She held his gaze for one moment where she understood exactly what he was and was not saying. And then she looked away, which was unusual for her. She picked up her hammer and made 3 more cuts that didn't strictly need to be made that afternoon. What she was feeling was something she hadn't felt in a very long time. Like she might be allowed to stay, not temporarily, not contingent, but stay on her own terms without an expiration date, without the constant background awareness of the conditions under which the permission might be revoked. She filed it carefully. Under later, in the part of herself where she kept things that were too important to examine, before she was ready. Ezra Vandemark arrived on a Tuesday. He came without announcement. and without explanation in the way of men who had explanations are generally unnecessary when the intentions are clear enough. He was 65 years old and built like a barn that had survived several hard winters, the kind of solid that isn't bulk, but is structure, the result of decades of actual work, rather than the performance of strength. White hair cropped close. Blue eyes that had the particular quality she associated with people who had spent their lives actually listening rather than waiting for their turn to talk. He walked onto the site, took off his hat, and watched Nora work for the better part of an hour. She knew he was there. She kept working. She had learned early that the best response to being watched was to give the watcher something worth seeing. After an hour, he walked to where Amos was fitting framing on the south wall and said, without preamble, "She holds a chisel the way her father did." Amos looked at him. "You knew Henrik Voss 40 years, Ezra said, turning his hat in his hands. "He was the most honest man I ever met in this territory. And I've met most of the men in this territory. He was the kind of man she'll plate before anyone asked him to," Ezra said, glancing at Nora across the site. "Because it needed doing, and he could see that it needed doing." He paused. "Apparently, that runs in families." That evening, Ezra sat on an upturned crate at the edge of the site and talked. Not to anyone in particular, or not in the way that a deliberate address is not to anyone in particular, while still being clearly aimed. He talked in the way of old men who have been holding a story long enough that it has begun to push against the walls of them, from the inside, to press at the seams, to become a thing that needs releasing. Nora sat on the ground a few feet away. Listening, Amos was somewhere behind her. She could hear him working, slower than usual, which meant he was listening too. Anna Vandemark came to Harrow's Bend in the spring of 1875, Ezra said, 19 years old. Her family had been in New Mexico territory for about 2 years by then, ranching land east of here. Her English was, he paused, he chose the word carefully, present, but approximate. A small sound from Nora that might have been recognition. She was not what this town expected, Ezra continued. She was Dutch in a way that this town didn't know what to do with. Spoke her mind directly. Looked people in the eye in the way women weren't supposed to look people in the eye. Priced things correctly at the market when merchants tried to shortchange her. He shook his head slowly. They called her the Dutch woman for 8 years. 8 years, and they couldn't be bothered to learn her name. The hammering behind Nora stopped. When she died in the winter of 1883, Ezra said, the same people who had spent those 8 years, treating her like a visitor who had stayed too long, sent flowers to the service. They said she was a fine woman. A credit to the community. He looked at the ground. I wanted to send those flowers back. Nora said nothing. She was listening with the part of her that processed stories, not as information but as experience. The part that sits with a thing and lets it work. Amos built this house because Anna wanted it, Ezra said. They chose the land together. She drew the windows herself. She wanted to prove something. Not to the town, exactly, but to the idea of a place. That she had the right to take up space in it. That her being here was not provisional, not contingent on anyone else's tolerance. He paused. The house isn't a memorial, it's an argument. He looked at Nora directly. You understand what I'm telling you? She did. She understood it in the chest, where things arrive before the mind catches up with them. She had spent 24 years being told, in 100 different tones, and in 100 different rooms by 100 different people who all thought they were the first to notice that her presence was conditional, that she could stay as long as she didn't take up too much space, as long as she didn't make it inconvenient for other people that she existed, as long as she was smaller, quieter, less. And here was this old man, turning his hat in his hands, telling her that a woman she'd never met had come to this same territory and had refused that bargain, had drawn window placements and chosen land, and built an argument against it with every board and beam, and had never gotten to see. The argument completed, Nora looked at the framing around her, the walls she'd helped raise, the blocking she'd doubled that morning, the shim on the east sill plate that had been done right, because it needed doing. She understood. The meeting hall was half full when she walked in, and the sound in the room changed, in the way sound always changes, when she enters a space she wasn't expected in. Not stopping exactly, thinning. Like air moving around something solid that has arrived without warning. She kept walking, third row, from the front. Aisle seat, because aisle seats allow you to see the whole room without turning around, and she wanted to see the whole room. She sat with her back straight, and her hands folded in her lap, and looked at the empty chairman's table at the front, as though she had every right to be there. Which she had decided she did. Bertie came in 2 minutes later and sat beside her without being asked. Present and immovable, the way Bertie was everything. Without drama, without announcement, simply as a fact. Gerald Whitmore came in at 5 past the hour, with the air of a man who expects to run things shortly. Amos came in at 7 past, with a man beside him. Older, carrying a leather satchel with the particular alert quality of someone who had ridden far and didn't intend to let it show. A lawyer. Nora didn't know his name. She knew what he was. She saw Whitmore register the satchel and go very still, in a specific way that told her Whitmore had not been expecting it. Amos took a seat across the room, found Nora's eyes the moment he sat down. Neither of them nodded. But something passed between them, the acknowledgement of two people who have separately decided the same thing and separately arrived at the same place. No ceremony required. The chairman, Burrell, called the meeting to order with the face of a man walking into a house he suspects is on fire. "We're here on the matter of the Hark property," he said. Specifically, a petition regarding property deed status and a separate matter of township ordinance compliance. His eyes found Nora involuntarily. She looked back at him pleasantly. Whitmore stood without being invited and stated his position with the practiced ease of a man who has rehearsed this. The deed was filed under the name Anna Vandemark in 1878. That name did not appear on subsequent legal transfer documents, under territorial inheritance law. A property titled in the name of a deceased spouse, the lawyer said from his seat, dry and completely unbothered, transfers by operation of existing territorial statute. Settled law in New Mexico Territory since 1872. I have the citation if anyone would like it. A ripple went through the room. Not agreement, not disagreement. The particular motion of a crowd that has just received information that complicates a position it hadn't been sure it held. The interpretation is debatable, Whitmore said. Most things are, the lawyer said. This one isn't. Whitmore pivoted. And the concern, he said, addressing the room now, rather than the chairman, is one of community standards. He was careful to keep his voice pleasant. We have built something here. The presence of. He paused, as though her name were difficult to locate. The young woman in question has created discussion. Discussion affects commerce. It affects families. He let that sit. Nora felt Bertie's hand press briefly on her arm. Not restraint, presence. The specific warmth of someone who is simply there. Then a voice from the back of the room said, "What discussion?" An older man, calloused hands. The look of someone who has worked land his whole life and stopped being impressed by men in good suits some decades ago. "I've been in this territory 23 years, he said. "I haven't heard any discussion that matters. I heard Mrs. Whitmore's book circle talking at the dry goods last week. That's not the same thing." Something moved through the room. Warmer than silence. "You made it the place," the man said when Whitmore objected, and sat down. Burrell asked Amos if he had anything to say. Amos stood. He didn't look at Whitmore. He looked at the room, at the people in the middle rows who had come, because this was their town, and this was happening in it, who had not yet decided what they thought. "I'm building a house on land my wife chose," he said. "She's gone. I'm finishing what we started. The woman I hired to help me is the best carpenter I've worked alongside in 15 years. I'm not here to ask anyone's permission for either of those facts. If there's a legal question, my lawyers answered it. If there's another kind of question, he left it open. You'll need to say it out loud so we can all hear what it actually is." The room stayed very quiet. Whitmore opened his mouth. "Sit down." Gerald, Constance, sitting in the second row. Her eyes had moved, sometime in the last few minutes, from Whitmore to Nora. She had been watching Nora sit with her back straight and her hands folded, and her face giving away nothing. The posture of a woman who has been in this room before, different rooms, different towns, always the same room, and something in Constance's expression had gone very still. The real kind of stillness. The kind that comes before a decision that cannot be undecided. "Sit down," she said again, quietly, finally. Gerald Whitmore sat down. The matter was closed. The vote was not unanimous, but it was enough. Nora didn't move for a long time after. She sat with her hands folded while the room emptied, feeling the specific hollowness that follows being braced for something that didn't arrive the way you feared. Not relief. Exactly. The feeling of a door you'd been pushing against swinging open, of stumbling through the absence of resistance. Amos was waiting near the door. He didn't say well done. He didn't say we won. He looked at her with those steady eyes and said, "You all right?" "Yes," she said. "Sure?" She thought about it. One honest second. "I will be," she said. That was enough for both of them. They stood in the emptying doorway for a moment, side by side, neither moving. "Anna," she said quietly. He looked at her. That was her name. "You never told me." "No," he said. "She picked the window placements." "Yes, they're good placements. The morning light is going to come through the east window and hit the whole length of the interior wall." Something moved through his face. Brief, deep. Gone before she could name it fully. She knew what she was doing, he said. She always did. They walked out into the dark in opposite directions. And Nora told herself the ache in her chest was just the leftover tension of the evening. The body releasing what it had been holding. She almost believed it. The morning after the meeting, Nora arrived at the site before the sun cleared the ridge. Old habit now. Her private competition with herself, though it had shifted from competition into something else. The simple fact of preferring to be there, of the site having become, in ways she was still mapping, a place she wanted to be, rather than a place she was going. She set her box down, picked up the cup on the left. Warm. He was already here. Of course he was. The silence between them was a different quality than it had been even 2 weeks ago. The silence of two people who have been through something together and are on the other side of it and are learning what the other side feels like. Not peaceful, exactly. Something larger than peaceful. More like the quality of air after a storm moves through. Cleared, specific, carrying the smell of what has passed. He told her, 4 days later, about Caldwell's membership on the property committee. The 12 years of quiet positioning. The deed challenge resolved before breakfast. She looked at the lumber stack. She made 3 cuts that didn't need making. She processed the specific feeling of discovering you are not alone in a thing you had been carrying as though you were. Ezra Vandemark returned with Ingrid, who was small in the way of women who have spent a long time deciding they don't need to be large to take up space. White hair, eyes like creek water. The posture of someone who has said difficult things to people who needed to hear them and has never once regretted it. "Liesel would have liked you," Ingrid said. No preamble. "Anna's mother," she explained. Stubborn and opinionated and impossible to argue with, once she'd made up her mind. She made the best apple cake I've tasted in 40 years, on this continent. Ingrid looked at the east window opening. She showed me that drawing, before she got sick. She said, "The whole point of a window is to remind you the world is still out there." Ingrid found the question without being asked for it. "You're thinking about leaving." "I haven't decided anything, I know." That's what thinking about it looks like. When Nora said there was an opportunity in Ohio, Jacobs led her the workshop, the word air that she had turned over in her mind until it was worn smooth. Ingrid was quiet, in the way of someone who knows the answer to a question someone else hasn't quite asked yet. "Child," Ingrid said, and the word was not condescending. It was the word of a woman old enough to use it without apology. I watched Amos Hark close himself up after Anna died like a house being shuttered for winter. 4 years. He didn't go anywhere. Didn't want anything. Just worked. None of us could figure out what he was waiting for. She paused. And then he placed an advertisement in a Philadelphia newspaper asking for someone who could tolerate heat. She let that sit. "And speak Dutch," Ingrid added. The sound of Amos's voice carried from around the north wall. Easy, unhurried. Talking to Ezra with the shorthand of old friendship, words mostly placeholders for things already understood. The register of that voice settled somewhere in Nora's chest, and quietly and completely refused to leave. "What do you want to say?" Ingrid asked, when Nora asked what she should say when he asked. Nora looked at the house. At the blocking she'd doubled, at the chalk lines, at the sill plate she'd shimmed before anyone told her it needed shimming. 6 weeks of her fingerprints on every surface. Not because she'd claimed it, because she'd shown up every morning and done what needed doing. "I want to say yes," she said. Ingrid smiled, not surprised, satisfied. "Then say yes," she said. That evening, the deed challenge escalated into something larger. Whitmore threatening the federal land office. A man named Corver, whose hotel bill was paid by whoever wanted a favorable ruling. The dwelling that had to be completed as a settlement requirement. The property reverting if Corver agreed it didn't count. And then, in the corner of the house Amos had never let her work on, the tin box with the 1877 application, predating everything Whitmore was using. Whitmore told the committee the deed was filed in 1878, Nora said. He was right about that. But he doesn't know this exists. Nobody files a survey without an application first, and this application is dated 1877. Before Briggs ever set foot on this land, Amos looked at her. "Go talk to him," she said. "Not the lawyer. You." A man who signed his name to something in good faith needs to be reminded what his name is worth. The lawyer can argue law. You can argue something else. He was quiet. "Can you manage the site alone?" he said. She looked at him. "I have been managing this site since day 5, she said. Something moved through his face. Not quite a smile. Something more essential. "Yes," he said. "You have." He left the next morning before she arrived. No goodbye, no list. But when she came to the site, the coffee was there. 1 cup, left side of the sawhorse, still warm. She stood for a moment holding it. Then she put it down, picked up her hammer, went to work alone. 3 days of work that was precise and focused and carried in it the specific quality of work done for someone who will come back and see it. She set the porch posts alone, 4 hours of bracing systems and physical effort she wouldn't tell him about. She fitted the window sashes on the north wall, using a rig of her own devising. She started the interior door trim, the kind of clean work that leaves no room for thinking about anything else. On the second afternoon, Deck held the far end of a long piece of casing for 45 minutes, while she fitted and refitted the corner joint, until it was exactly right. "Why does it matter that much?" he said. "The corner. Nobody's going to look that close." She ran her thumb along the joint, felt the seam. "Flush, clean, true." "Anna Hark will," she said. He blinked. "I know," Nora said. Deck was quiet for a moment. Then, "Oh." Like he understood. Maybe he did. The third evening she sat on the half-finished porch with the carpentry box open beside her. Jacob's letter in her hands. The letters she'd never sent in a stack. Ohio on one side of the scale, and this on the other. The workshop in Columbus. The workbench her father and Jacob had built when they were 8 years old. A place that knew where she came from. And here. A site half a mile north of a feedlot. A man who said 12 words a day and somehow always said the right ones. A porch she was sitting on. A house she'd helped build from the foundation up. A sill plate shimmed before anyone told her it needed shimming. She looked at the house in the dark. It held. She heard hoofbeats before she saw the lantern. 3 days early. Amos came around the corner at a pace that said something had gone either very well or very badly. She didn't know which until she saw his face in the lamplight. Briggs withdrew the testimony, he said, filed a formal retraction. Corver's hearing suspended. "You convinced him," she said. "I showed him the 1877 document, and I asked him whether he wanted his name on a lie for the rest of his life." A pause. "He cried," Amos said. Quiet. Without judgment. "He's 72 years old. He surveyed half of New Mexico territory. He sat in his kitchen and cried." "Is it over?" she said. "Closest to over," he said. He looked at the porch she'd worked on, at the rail she'd sanded, at the door frame fitted clean and square. "You set the porch posts," he said. "They needed setting. That's a 2-person job." "It was a 1-person job," she said. "This time." The conversation that followed was brief and not brief. The short exchanges of 2 people, in the dark outside a house they had built together, each piece of information standing for more than itself. Then he said, Nora, her first name. Just like that. Without announcement, she waited. If I were to ask you something, he said, when the house is finished, I'm not asking now. But when it's finished, ask me then, she said. All right, he said. He tied his horse, walked into the house. She heard his boots on the floor she'd fitted and leveled. She sat back down on the porch, picked up Jacob's letter, held it, then folded it carefully. She did not put it in the box with the letters she'd never sent. She set it on the windowsill instead, out of the box. That was different. That was new. The morning after he came back, she arrived at the site before the light. Not from competition now. Not from the deliberateness of someone executing a decision before doubt can find its footing. From the simple fact of wanting to be there, of waking in the narrow bed before the alarm she hadn't set, with her mind already on the last of the trim, on the sequence of what still needed doing, on the specific satisfaction of work that is in its final stage and knows it. She stood at the edge of the site and looked at the house in the dark. It was almost done. She could see it now, in a way she hadn't been able to see it in July, when it had been a foundation and a hope. Not because it had changed, though it had changed substantially, board by board over 6 weeks, but because she had changed. When you work on something long enough, you stop seeing the individual pieces and start seeing the thing they're becoming. The walls weren't just framing anymore. They were rooms. The window openings weren't just rough cuts. They were light, specific light, the kind Anna had calculated and drawn in December of 1882, knowing that she might not be the one to stand in it. Nora put her hand on the east wall, cool in the pre-dawn, smooth where she'd sanded. Solid in the way that things are solid when they've been built right. Not perfect. Right, those were different things. Her father had told her so. She'd spent years trying to make things perfect, and he'd watched her and waited and finally said, Nora, perfect is what you call something when you've run out of excuses to keep working on it. Right is what you call something when it's done what it's supposed to do. She understood that now. She understood a lot of things now that she hadn't understood in July. Amos was at the site by the time the light came up. He handed her a coffee cup, left side of the sawhorse, and they stood in the early light and watched it arrive through the east window. The glass had gone in last week. Both of them handling the pains with the attention you give something that can't be replaced locally if you break it. The light came in and lay itself across the interior floor in a stripe that moved as the sun moved. Slowly, deliberately. She measured that, Amos said from behind her. Not loud, just a fact. I know, Nora said. She was right about the angle. She was right about most things. The stripe moved another inch. Cyrus Ogle arrived at mid-morning to file the final responses. He was the kind of lawyer who understood that time was a resource and didn't waste it. Without Briggs, Whitmore had nothing to build on. The 1877 document predated his entire argument. Give it 2 weeks, he left the way he arrived, without ceremony. 2 weeks, Nora said. Maybe less, Amos said. She picked up her plane. Then we'd better finish the trim. The bedroom door casing went in that afternoon, fitted with the focus she brought to final things. The corner block at the depth she'd calculated 3 weeks ago, the head casing level. The side casings plumb, every joint tight, almost checked it when she was done. He used his eye, not the level. He ran his hand along the corner joint, pressed his thumbnail into the seam. Nothing, no gap, no flex. Correct, he said. She bit the inside of her cheek. Just correct? Exactly correct. There was the change in his breathing she had catalogued. She didn't turn around. I know you're doing that, she said. Doing what, that thing? With your breathing. I breathe continuously. It's involuntary. Amos, Nora. She turned around. He was not smiling, but close to it. Something in the neighborhood of smiling. The casing is excellent, he said. Thank you. She said with dignity. The corner block is the best fitted corner block I've seen in 15 years. I know, you know. I measured it 4 times. I could tell. The window casing, east wall, went in on a Thursday, the last one. She fitted each piece with the kind of focus you bring to final things. Not hurried, not slow. The pace the work required. The corner blocks at the depth she'd calculated to account for the plaster thickness. Every joint tight, every surface flush. She ran her hand along the casing when it was done. The way you feel something you've been working toward. Not triumph, not relief. The quiet arrival of a thing that has been becoming true for a long time and has simply finished becoming. She stepped back. Amos was behind her. He'd been working on the opposite wall but had stopped. He was looking at the window, at the light coming through at the morning angle, at the stripe of it on the interior floor. It had reached the far wall. At 9:47, Anna had written in the margin of the December drawing, "Morning light should reach the far wall by 10:9:47. 13 minutes ahead of schedule, but that felt exactly right. Amos walked to the window, stood beside it, put his hand on the casing the way Nora had, feeling the joint, the fit. He didn't say anything for a long time. She would have stood right here, he said, quiet, just the truth of it. I know, Nora said. They stood in the light that Anna had planned, and neither of them moved. Because some things don't need to be moved away from. Some things need to be stood in until they settle, until the weight of them becomes something you can carry rather than something that carries you. The conversation that followed was brief in words and long in what the words carried. The porch rail done. The front step level, a point he had apparently decided to dispute despite the double-checking, despite the self-evidence of levelness. I checked it twice, she said, which implies you checked it twice. Different thing. She looked at him. He looked at her. And something that had been building across 6 weeks of early mornings, and chalk lines, and shimmed sills, and coffee cups, and careful silences. Something that had been building without either of them naming it. Because naming it would have required stopping and stopping, was not something either of them did well. That something arrived, quietly. The way the light had arrived at the far wall, right on time. The house is finished, he said. She looked around the room. At the trim. At the ceiling set 6 inches lower than planned. The argument, she'd won that gave the room its height and warmth. At the floor she'd leveled. At the window Anna had placed. It is, she said. Then I want to ask you something. She waited. He reached into his coat pocket, brought out a key, plain iron, heavy. The kind a blacksmith makes without decoration for a door that actually gets used. That will be put in a lock and turned many times by someone who knows the house behind it. He held it out. She looked at it. Stay, he said one word. The way he said most things, without scaffolding, without the cushioning that most people wrapped around words they were nervous about. Not on a contract, he said. Not until the next job or the next letter or until Ohio starts to seem like the sensible choice. He held the key steady. Stay because this is where you belong. Because you shimmed a sill plate before anyone told you it needed shimming. Because you set those porch posts alone and didn't tell me how long it took. Because every morning you got here before me and you worked like it mattered, and it did matter, and you knew it did. He stopped. Let a breath out. Stay, he said, because I don't want to drink coffee from one cup. She stood very still. That last one, she said. I mean all of them, he said. I know, she said, but that one is the one I'm going to remember. She took the key. It was warm from his hand, the warmth of something carried close. She looked at it. This plain, heavy, honest thing. No ornament, just iron formed into a shape with exactly one purpose, and something that had been wound tight in her chest for 4 years, or longer. Maybe since her father's hands stopped working, and the workshop was sold and she went to live in her uncle's house, where she was too large and too loud and too present. In every room she walked into, something let go, so quietly she almost missed it. Yes, she said. He looked at her with an expression that was not relief, not triumph, not the expression of a man who has won something. It was the expression of a man who has been traveling for a very long time and has recognized, with certainty and without drama, the place. There's still work to do, he said. The outbuilding. The fencing. The root cellar hasn't been started. I know. I've been thinking about the drainage if we... Nora, he said. She stopped. He stepped forward, put both hands on her face, carefully. The way you hold something you've been thinking about, holding long enough that the thought has worn smooth. And he kissed her once, clean, certain. The way a man kisses a woman when he has thought about it long enough that there is no hesitation left in him. She was very still for one breath, then she kissed him back. When they separated, she kept her eyes closed for a moment, then opened them, looked at him. "The drainage," she said. He laughed. Fully, completely. Not the quiet, almost sound from the first week. A real laugh. The kind that changes a man's face and shows you what he looked like before the hard years. The kind that takes years to return to a person and sounds when it comes back, like something being unlocked from the inside. The drainage, he agreed, and let her go. They sat on the finished porch that evening until the stars were fully out, talking about the outbuilding framing and the root cellar drainage, and whether cedar posts would hold better than pine in that soil type. The most ordinary conversation in the world. And also the thing she had been looking for without knowing what to call it. "The house needs a name," she said. He looked at her. "Houses don't need names. Some do. Which houses? The ones that cost this much to finish. The ones that took this long." She looked out at the property, at the dark shape of the outbuilding frame, at the ridge where the stars were coming out. Did Anna call it anything? When you were planning it? Silence. Long enough that she thought he wasn't going to answer. Twos. He said the Dutch word came out of him carefully, like something he'd kept in a specific place and hadn't taken out for a while. Like something he was deciding, in this moment, to give. She knew the word. Her father had used it, not for buildings, for the feeling, the state of being in the right place. Not just at home in the geographic sense, but home in the way that isn't about geography. The home that's inside you when you've finally stopped running from the thing you were running toward all along. "Then that's the name," she said. He was quiet for a long moment, long enough that she thought she might have overstepped, taken something that wasn't hers. "Then, yes," he said. Soft and certain, she wrote to Jacob the following morning. 2 letters total. The first written before the house was finished, the second an addition now that she knew more completely why. "I built the kind of life," she wrote, "where someone asks me what I want and then waits, actually waits for the answer. I didn't know that was a thing that could happen. My father knew. That's why he stayed in his workshop. Not because of the furniture. Because of the particular quality of working alongside someone who respects what you can do. I have that now." She folded both letters into one envelope, put it by the door. Not in the box with the letters she'd never sent, out the door. Into the world. Bertie poured 2 cups of coffee when she came downstairs, set one on the left side of the table. "You're not leaving," she said, not a question. "No," Nora said. "Good," Bertie said. "Just that, good." She arrived at the site and Amos was there. 2 coffee cups on the sawhorse. Left. Right. She took hers, and they talked about drainage and slope angles and soil composition. He listened, asked one question, said, "That'll work." With the conviction of a man who knows the difference between a good idea and the right one. She finished her coffee, set the cup on the sawhorse, picked up her tools, stood for one moment in the doorway of the house they had built together. The house with the east window where the light came through at 9:47. The ceiling joists 6 inches lower than planned. The corner block measured 4 times. The porch posts set in 4 hours alone. The trim fitted joint by joint until every surface was clean and true. She felt it from the floor through the soles of her boots, through her whole body. The specific solidity of a thing built right. Not perfect right. And underneath that, or maybe through it, something that didn't have a carpentry word. The feeling of a woman who has walked a long way and put down her bag and looked around and thought, "Oh, this is the place. Not the place I was heading. The place I was heading toward." She had $12 in July, a box of tools, a name on a scrap of paper. She had argued with a man about chalk lines. She had shimmed a sill plate before anyone told her it needed shimming. She had stood in a room full of people who wanted her gone and looked straight back at them. She had set porch posts alone in 4 hours and told no one it was hard. She had fitted a corner block 4 times until it was correct, not better. Correct, she had learned the difference. She walked in, she picked up her hammer, and Nora Voss, who had burned a letter on a platform in July with $12, and her father's tools, and the particular stubbornness of a woman, who has been told all her life to take up less room and has finally decided not to, drove the first nail of the day into the wood of her own home. Clean sure, all the way in, she was exactly where she was supposed to be, and she was never leaving.